On a cold December morning in 1945, inside Hamelin Prison, the echoing sound of footsteps led 3 women to the gallows. They were not victims, but hands deeply stained by one of the most horrific crimes of World War II. Irma Grese, the beautiful beast. Elisabeth Volkenrath, the cold-blooded chief overseer. And Johanna Bormann, the handler of deadly dogs. All had once spread terror throughout the Bergen Belsen concentration camp, but today, they would pay the price. This story is not only about justice, but also reveals a chilling truth. Cruelty knows no gender. Subscribe to the channel to watch the full story and never miss the most gripping and authentic videos we bring to you. Part 1. The December morning and the historic moment at Hamelin. On a cold December morning in 1945, the cold gray walls of Hamelin Prison echoed with slow yet resolute footsteps. Etched dry, hollow sound on the stone floor seemed to herald a moment that would enter history. In the dim light of dawn, a group of women was led to the gallows. They walked between 2 rows of guards, their faces stern and unyielding. These were not ordinary criminals, but former SS female guards of the Bergen Belsen concentration camp, a place that had become a symbol of the most barbaric atrocities of the Nazi era. Among them, 3 names stood out as emblems of cruelty and moral corruption. Irma Grese, nicknamed the Beautiful Beast. Elisabeth Volkenrath, the cold-blooded chief overseer. And Johanna Bormann, the handler of vicious dogs that spread terror among prisoners. Their dark reputations had already spread across the globe, even before the executioner's rope, wielded by a British hangman, tightened around their necks. The execution of these 3 women shocked the entire world. What left the public reeling was not only the scale of the crimes they had committed, but also the fact that they were women individuals traditionally associated with gentleness and compassion, who had once held the terrifying power of a killing machine, and had wielded that power to slaughter and oppress without mercy. To fully understand why they stood upon the gallows, one must return to the final months of World War II. When Allied forces entered Bergen Belsen, they revealed the camp's true face, a place where death was present in every corner. Even the most battle-hardened soldiers shuddered at what they saw. Piles of corpses stacked high, skeletal bodies ravaged by starvation, disease spreading everywhere, and the stench of death saturating the air. Those horrific living conditions, combined with the systematic cruelty of the camp guards, ignited worldwide outrage and demands for the harshest possible punishment. The fact that these 3 women were brought to the gallows in Hamelin was not a sudden act of vengeance, but the result of a meticulous investigation, a public trial, and the resolute execution of justice. It was a statement that crimes, whether committed by men or women, under any guise, would be made to pay the ultimate price. Part 2. From prisoner of war camp to the hell of Bergen Belsen. Bergen Belsen was originally established in 1940 as a prisoner of war camp. However, by 1943, it had been transformed into a concentration camp under the control of the SS. Located in Lower Saxony, Germany, the camp quickly became infamous not for having gas chambers like Auschwitz, but for the appalling living conditions that claimed tens of thousands of lives. Death in Bergen Belsen did not come primarily through systematic extermination in chambers, but through starvation, rampant disease, and total neglect, which together pushed the death toll to staggering levels. When British forces entered and liberated the camp on April 15th, 1945. The sight that greeted them was nothing short of nightmarish. Over 60,000 survivors remained so emaciated that many were little more than skin stretched over bone. Scattered among them were more than 13,000 unburied corpses, lying in open pits or where they had fallen. The overwhelming stench of decomposition filled the air, mingling with the foul odor of disease, creating an atmosphere so suffocating that soldiers and medics struggled to work within it. The name Belsen instantly became synonymous with human misery, a byword for the horrors of unchecked cruelty and neglect. The camp's operation relied not only on male guards, but also on a significant force of female SS personnel who played critical roles in the daily running of the facility. These women were far from mere bystanders. They exercised direct authority over prisoners, enforced harsh discipline, and were often active participants in the brutality across the Nazi concentration camp system. Approximately 3,600 women served as guards, and Bergen Belsen alone employed dozens of them at various times during its existence. Their responsibilities extended beyond passive oversight. Many were directly involved in maintaining oppressive control over inmates, conducting roll calls, overseeing forced labor, and administering punishments that ranged from physical beatings to deprivation of food and medical care. This authority gave them substantial power over the lives of the prisoners, a power that was frequently abused. At Bergen Belsen, as in other camps, female guards were an integral part of the machinery of oppression and destruction. By the time liberation came, the role of these women was undeniable. Their presence and participation in the daily life of the camp meant they were not incidental figures, but active components of the Nazi apparatus of terror. They had stood on the front lines of human suffering, not as rescuers, but as enforcers of a system designed to degrade, exhaust, and ultimately destroy its captives. In the aftermath, their actions, and in many cases, their identities, would be brought into sharp focus as the world sought to understand how Bergen Belsen had descended into such an abyss of inhumanity. Part 3. Recruitment, Training, and the Power of the Female Guards. The women who became guards at Bergen Belsen most often came from working-class backgrounds. Many had limited education and few prospects in civilian life. They were recruited into the SS Guard service, sometimes through employment agencies or direct enlistment, and then sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp, the primary training facility for female SS personnel at Ravensbrück. They underwent a strict and uncompromising training regimen. This program not only taught them the rules and procedures of camp discipline, but also indoctrinated them into the ideology of absolute obedience to the Nazi state and the dehumanization of prisoners. Once assigned to Bergen Belsen, these women were placed in positions of authority over female prisoners. In theory, their role was to maintain order and ensure the smooth operation of camp routines. In practice, however, this authority often became a tool of oppression and violence. They did not merely enforce discipline, they regularly imposed brutal punishments that could cripple or kill. Survivors recalled beatings administered with fists, sticks, or whips, relentless forced labor assignments that drove prisoners to exhaustion, and constant verbal abuse intended to strip inmates of dignity. Contrary to the social stereotype of the era, which often cast women as inherently gentle and nurturing, many of these female guards wielded genuine power and used it to instill fear and exert psychological terror over those under their control. Witness accounts describe scenes of unrestrained brutality, women guards kicking and striking inmates without provocation, setting trained dogs on prisoners as a form of punishment or sport, and personally participating in selection processes. In these selections, prisoners deemed unfit for work, whether from illness, injury, or perceived weakness, were chosen for transport to extermination camps. A decision that was, in effect, a death sentence. Among the most notorious was Irma Grese, infamous for her sadistic tendencies and apparent enjoyment of prisoner suffering. Known to carry a whip and a pistol, she cultivated an image of dominance and cruelty. Elisabeth Volkenrath, a senior overseer, exercised strict control over other female guards and ensured the continuation of harsh disciplinary measures. Johanna Bormann earned hatred across the camp for her aggression toward prisoners, particularly for unleashing her dogs without hesitation. By the time British forces liberated Bergen Belsen in April 1945, the atrocities committed under the watch of these women were well known among survivors. The urgency of the situation left no room for delay. Allied authorities moved quickly to identify, arrest, and prepare these individuals for trial. For those who had inflicted fear and death on tens of thousands, liberation did not mean escape. It meant the beginning of their own reckoning. In the weeks that followed, the names and faces of Bergen Belsen's female guards would move from the shadows of the camp into the spotlight of the courtroom, where their actions would be laid bare before the world. Part 4. The Belsen Trial and the Evidence of Guilt. After the liberation of Bergen Belsen, the testimonies of surviving prisoners painted a horrifying portrait of a system of abuse that was both deliberate and methodically organized. The accounts were consistent and detailed, describing a daily reality of cruelty, neglect, and violence that left no doubt about the culpability of the camp's staff. The evidence against the guards, both male and female, was overwhelming, prompting the Allied authorities to convene a special tribunal to bring them to justice. This tribunal, officially titled The Trial of Joseph Kramer and 44 Others, was held in the German city of Lüneburg from September 17th to November 17th, 1945. In total, 45 defendants stood in the dock, a mix of men and women. Among them were 16 women, many of whom had served as guards in the camp system. Some were strikingly young. Irma Grese, for example, was only 21 years old at the time of the trial. The charges brought against them were grave, crimes against humanity and war crimes, specifically involving the killing, mistreatment, and willful neglect of prisoners that led directly to countless deaths. Witness after witness took the stand to describe scenes of merciless beatings, prisoners being set upon by dogs, and selections in which certain inmates were marked for transport to extermination camps, transports from which no one returned. Notably, several defendants had previously served at Auschwitz before being transferred to Bergen Belsen in the final chaotic months of the war. Their experience in other camps had given them familiarity with the mechanisms of oppression and death, and they brought those same practices with them to Belsen. The transition of personnel between camps underscored the interconnected nature of the Nazi concentration camp system, where cruelty was not the product of isolated individuals, but of a broader, institutionalized policy of terror. The trial was conducted openly, with press access and international observation. Ensuring that the proceedings were reported across the world, It attracted considerable public attention, both because of the shocking details revealed in court and because it was one of the first major post-war trials to address atrocities committed in concentration camps. The presence of so many female defendants also drew heightened interest, challenging prevailing notions about the nature of women in positions of power during wartime. As the testimonies accumulated, the courtroom became a place where survivors could confront their tormentors and where the broader public could begin to comprehend the scale of suffering inside Bergen Belsen. For the accused, many of whom had once wielded unchecked authority over life and death. The trial marked the beginning of a complete reversal of fortune. For the survivors, it was the first step toward a measure of justice in the wake of unimaginable loss. Part 5. Death Sentences and Three Names. Etched into history. The Belsen trial affirmed a crucial principle. Women would not receive leniency simply because of their gender. Every act of criminality was to be judged by the same standard, regardless of whether it was committed by a man or a woman. When the verdicts were delivered, 11 of the accused were sentenced to death. Among them, 3 women whose names would forever be associated with the brutality of the Bergen Belsen concentration camp: Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann. The sentencing was a rare and shocking moment in legal history. As women were seldom executed for war crimes, Irma Grese, nicknamed the Beautiful Beast, was born in 1923. She joined the SS at the age of 19. After working on a farm and briefly in a hospital, following hair training at Ravensbrück, she was assigned to Auschwitz, where she quickly earned notoriety for her cruelty. Survivors recounted how she carried a whip and a pistol, unleashed dogs on prisoners, and took part in selection processes that determined who would be sent to the gas chambers. Her presence was synonymous with fear and humiliation for those under her control. In March 1945, as the war neared its end, Grese was transferred to Bergen Belsen. There, her reputation for sadism continued unabated until the camp's liberation by British forces. Elisabeth Volkenrath, born in 1919, held the position of Oberaufseherin-Chief, female overseer, first at Auschwitz and later at Bergen Belsen, known for her cold, disciplined demeanor and unwavering loyalty to the SS. She commanded other female guards and ensured the enforcement of strict, often brutal disciplinary measures. Survivors described her as stern and unyielding, a figure who embodied the regimented cruelty of the Nazi concentration camp system. Her authority extended over both staff and prisoners, making her one of the most feared figures in the camp hierarchy. Johanna Bormann, the oldest of the 3, was born in 1993. She had a long history of service in the camp system, including time at Ravensbrück and Auschwitz. Before being transferred to Bergen Belsen, Bormann became infamous for her use of dogs to intimidate and attack prisoners, often without provocation. Witnesses testified that she routinely beat inmates without cause, inflicting both physical and psychological torment. Her cruelty was so consistent that she was despised by nearly all who encountered her. Together, these 3 women came to symbolize the capacity for female-perpetrated brutality within the Nazi regime. Their actions, preserved in survivor testimony and court records, shattered stereotypes of women as inherently nurturing or compassionate. On a December morning in 1945, they ascended the gallows at Hamelin Prison, meeting the ultimate penalty for their crimes. Their executions sent a clear message. The machinery of justice would make no distinction based on gender, and those who wielded power to destroy lives would face the same fate, whether man or woman. Part 6. Irma Grese, the beautiful beast, and a youth stained with blood. Irma Grese was the most haunting figure among the female guards at Bergen Belsen. Born in 1923 into a modest family, she left school early and worked first on a farm and then briefly in a hospital. At the age of 19, Grese joined the SS and was quickly sent to the Ravensbrück training camp for female guards. From there, she was assigned to Auschwitz, where she began to build the infamous reputation for cruelty that would follow her for the rest of her short life. Witnesses recalled that Grese was rarely seen without her leather whip and pistol, symbols of her authority and instruments of terror. She displayed a particular penchant for setting dogs on prisoners or personally beating them without hesitation. Even more chilling, she was frequently involved in the selection process, choosing those deemed too weak, sick, or incapable of work to be sent directly to the gas chambers. This role placed her at the very heart of the machinery of mass murder, making her not only a perpetrator of brutality, but also an active participant in systematic extermination. In March 1945, Grese was transferred to Bergen Belsen. Despite the war clearly turning against Germany and the Nazi regime facing imminent collapse, her brutality did not diminish. Survivors described the same sadistic behavior: physical assaults, dog attacks, and intimidation, continuing up to the camp's liberation by British forces in April. The chaos and desperation of the final months did nothing to temper her cruelty. Instead, it seemed to reinforce her dominance over the prisoners. At the Belsen trial, Grese's demeanor shocked many. She appeared cold, at times even defiant, and showed no sign of remorse, despite the harrowing testimony of numerous survivors. Accounts from the courtroom describe her listening to witnesses without visible emotion, as though untouched by the stories of suffering and death in which she had played a central role. When the verdict was delivered, she was sentenced to death. At only 22 years old, Irma Grese became the youngest woman executed under British law in the 20th century. On the morning of December 13, 1945, she was led to the gallows at Hamelin Prison. Observers noted her eerie composure. According to reports, she uttered the word "Schnell," hurry, before the trapdoor opened beneath her feet. Her death remains one of the most discussed and controversial executions of the post-war era. For some, it was a clear and necessary act of justice for crimes that defied comprehension. For others, it became a stark reminder that brutality is not confined to any one gender or age. Irma Grese's story endures as both a symbol of unrepentant cruelty and an unsettling example of how ordinary youth can be transformed into an agent of extraordinary evil. Part 7. Elisabeth Volkenrath, the cold-blooded chief overseer. Elisabeth Volkenrath, born in 1919, was not known for explosive outbursts of violence like Irma Grese. Instead, she was remembered for her cold, calculating nature and her unwavering discipline. In her role as Oberaufseherin, the highest position attainable for a female overseer within the SS system, coming from an ordinary background, she joined the SS and was assigned to Auschwitz, where she quickly rose to a position of authority. In that role, she coordinated the activities of the female guards under her command, maintaining strict order and ensuring that camp regulations were enforced without compromise. Volkenrath's duties went beyond administration She directly organized punishment sessions, oversaw the selection of prisoners to be sent to the gas chambers, and ensured that the orders of the SS were carried out with what she regarded as maximum efficiency. Her cruelty did not stem from uncontrolled rage, but from a detached, almost bureaucratic approach to death. For her, executions, selections, and punishments appeared to be routine tasks, part of the daily functioning of the camp. In early 1945, as the tide of the war turned decisively against Germany, Volkenrath was transferred to Bergen Belsen, even in the chaos of the war's final months. She maintained rigid discipline among the guards, enforcing SS policies with the same cold precision she had demonstrated at Auschwitz. Witnesses described her as a woman of few words, her face perpetually set in a stern expression. She never revealed emotion except, according to survivors, when she was issuing orders for punishment or directing the deadly selection process. At the Belsen trial, Volkenrath faced charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Survivors testified to her role in orchestrating acts that led directly to the suffering and deaths of countless prisoners. She did not display visible distress or protest during the proceedings. When the death sentence was pronounced, she received it without outward reaction, remaining composed and silent. On the morning of December 13th, 1945, Elisabeth Volkenrath ascended the gallows alongside Irma Grese and Johanna Bormann at Hamelin Prison. She went to her death quietly, maintaining the same controlled demeanor that had defined her career as one of the most feared female figures in the Nazi concentration camp hierarchy. Her execution marked the fall of one of the highest-ranking female leaders in the Nazi extermination system. While her name may not have been sensationalized to the same degree as Grese's, Volkenrath's legacy was no less grim. She embodied the capacity for methodical, unfeeling cruelty, a reminder that the machinery of mass murder relied not only on overt brutality, but also on the cold, efficient enforcement of inhumane policies. In the end, her silence on the gallows spoke as loudly as any words could, sealing her place in history as a symbol of disciplined, remorseless oppression. Part 8. Johanna Bormann, the Wolf of the Concentration Camp. Johanna Bormann, born in 1893, was one of the oldest female guards to be tried at the Belsen trial. Before joining the SS, she worked as a domestic servant. In 1938, she began her service at Ravensbrück concentration camp and was later transferred to Auschwitz, where she quickly became infamous for her habit of setting dogs on prisoners. Survivors recounted in vivid detail how she used her dogs as instruments of punishment and intimidation, sometimes for the smallest infractions, or for no reason at all. Bormann's cruelty was not confined to the use of animals. She personally participated in beatings, striking prisoners with sticks or with her bare hands. The violence was often indiscriminate, driven less by official orders and more by her own initiative. Witnesses described her as someone who seemed to relish the power she held over the inmates, using it to instill fear and maintain control through a constant threat of physical harm. In late 1944, Johanna Bormann was transferred to Bergen Belsen. There, she continued to employ the same methods of terror she had used in previous camps, relying on her dogs to enforce her authority and resorting to physical assaults as a regular part of her duties. Prisoners under her supervision lived in constant dread, never knowing when she might strike or unleash her animals. During the Belsen trial, Bormann frequently defended herself by claiming that she was only following orders and that she had no authority to refuse instructions from her superiors. However, the weight of survivor testimony told a different story. Multiple witnesses independently confirmed that she not only carried out orders, but also acted on her own initiative, often seizing opportunities to punish inmates beyond what was required. This evidence demonstrated that her actions went far beyond the limits of just following orders and revealed a personal commitment to brutality. The court concluded that Johanna Bormann's conduct constituted serious war crimes. Her repeated use of dogs as weapons, her active participation in beatings, and her willingness to act without provocation marked her as more than a passive participant in the camp's cruelty. She was instead a willing and enthusiastic enforcer of its most inhumane practices, sentenced to death. Bormann's demeanor changed noticeably in the days leading up to her execution. Unlike the calm defiance of Irma Grese or the silent composure of Elisabeth Volkenrath, Bormann showed visible fear. On the morning of December 13, 1945, as she was led to the gallows at Hamelin Prison, she was reported to have cried out in panic, a stark contrast to the unflinching attitudes of her fellow condemned. In that final moment, the wolf of the concentration camp faced the end, not with cold resolve, but with the fear and desperation that so many of her victims had felt under her rule. Part 9. The Execution Morning at Hamelin Prison. On December 13, 1945, a heavy and oppressive atmosphere settled over Hamelin Prison, a formidable fortress situated along the banks of the River Weser. This was the site chosen to carry out the death sentences handed down to 11 defendants from the Belsen trial. Among them, the 3 infamous female guards, whose names had become synonymous with cruelty: Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann. The task of execution fell to Albert Pierrepoint. Widely regarded as Britain's foremost expert in the grim profession of hanging, although the executions were not held in an open public square, they were far from being shrouded in secrecy. The British authorities ensured the presence of military officials, accredited journalists, and official witnesses to bear testimony to the events. The intention was clear. The proceedings would be documented, and the message of justice would be unmistakable. News of what took place within the prison walls would spread quickly, both across Britain and to the wider world. Pierrepoint, known for his speed and precision, conducted the hangings with practiced efficiency. Irma Grese was the first to ascend the gallows. Witnesses reported her demeanor as calm disturbingly, so her face showing no fear or hesitation. As she stood on the trap door, she was said to have uttered the single word "Schnell," hurry, oh? A final, almost defiant gesture before Pierrepoint released the mechanism and ended her life. Next came Elisabeth Volkenrath. In stark contrast to Grese, she maintained complete silence. There were no last words, no visible signs of emotion. She walked to the scaffold with the same stoic composure she had shown throughout her trial and sentencing, meeting her fate without outward resistance. Finally, Johanna Bormann was led to the gallows. Unlike her 2 co-defendants, her fear was evident. Witnesses described her as visibly shaken, her steps unsteady. As the noose was placed around her neck, she reportedly cried out in panic, a sharp, human cry that broke the otherwise controlled and mechanical rhythm of the executions. Moments later, Pierrepoint carried out his duty, and her life, too, was brought to an abrupt end. In just a matter of minutes, the three women were dead. Their executions marked the largest mass hanging of female war criminals in British history. The speed with which the hangings were completed did nothing to lessen their impact. The event immediately reverberated across the globe, not only because of the scale of the crimes these women had committed, but also because of the unmistakable message it conveyed. Justice would not differentiate between genders or ranks. The morning at Hamelin Prison thus became a defining moment in the post-war pursuit of accountability. It stood as both a symbolic and practical demonstration that the Allied powers intended to ensure that those who had committed atrocities, regardless of who they were, would face the full weight of the law. Part 10. The impact and symbolism of the executions. Although carried out within the confined setting of Hamelin Prison, the executions there were public in the sense that information about them was deliberately disseminated. Major newspapers quickly reported the events, emphasizing the extraordinary rarity of three women being hanged for war crimes. Irma Grese was branded with sensational epithets such as the Beautiful Beast and the Witch of Belsen, labels that stirred a mixture of horror and morbid curiosity due to her youth and physical appearance. In contrast, Elisabeth Volkenrath and Johanna Bormann were less sensationalized in the press. Yet they remained firmly in public memory as undeniable proof that women could be as ruthless as men when placed in positions of power. Politically, the executions underscored the Allied commitment to justice. No individual, regardless of gender or rank, would be exempt from accountability for atrocities. This was a clear signal to the world that the post-war tribunals were not symbolic gestures, but concrete actions aimed at punishing those responsible for the machinery of persecution and death. The sight described and circulated widely of three women executed on the same day became one of the most powerful visual and symbolic representations of post-war justice. The event also sparked enduring debates about the role of women in systems of violence and oppression. Prior to and during the war, prevailing stereotypes often cast women as passive victims or moral guardians. The Belsen trial and the hangings at Hamelin shattered that perception. The actions of Grese, Volkenrath, and Bormann demonstrated that cruelty and moral corruption were not inherently tied to gender. In the wrong circumstances, and with authority in hand, women could be equally complicit in acts of inhumanity. From a social perspective, the executions served as a stark reminder that war did not exclusively produce male perpetrators of atrocity. It exposed a darker blank, less acknowledged truth that the capability for evil can manifest in anyone, given the right combination of ideology, power, and opportunity. This realization challenged public assumptions and forced historians, legal scholars, and society at large to reconsider how responsibility should be judged in the context of mass crimes. For survivors of Bergen Belsen, the deaths of the three female guards offered a measure of closure. While no judicial outcome could erase the trauma of the camp, seeing those who had inflicted suffering face the ultimate punishment provided a sense of moral redress. It was not revenge, but rather a confirmation that their suffering had been acknowledged and that justice, however delayed, had been served. In the broader narrative of the post-war period, the executions at Hamelin came to stand as both a legal precedent and a moral warning. They reinforce the principle that authority carries responsibility and that the abuse of such authority, whether by a man or a woman, would not go unanswered. The legacy of that December morning endures as a symbol of justice's reach and as a cautionary tale about the human capacity for cruelty